So this is the nerdy portion of your morning. So buckle in, get ready. We're going to go ahead and go through some of the demographics of wealth holding in America sort of writ large, because I think that's a good way to get into this question of what is happening with women's wealth. So I'm going to start with just the aggregate data, lumping men and women together. A lot of these first slides aren't female specific, but the data source we're using is the Survey of Income and Program Participation from the Census Bureau. It's a really nice panel. If you want to check it out online, the most recent data is from 2014, but it is based on a household survey, traces people over 4 years. So sort of best-in-class data here. So this is a nice graph that shows you that unsurprisingly, as households age, they tend to build up their net worth. So I guess this is probably not surprising to any of you folks. What's interesting here, though, is how this breaks out not just by age, but also by education. So this is net worth for everybody across the entire age distribution by the degree they hold. And you can see that you kind of get this nice little bump up as you go up, but when things really take off is when people go to their bachelor's degree, and then particularly when they go to that graduate or professional degree, which fits with a lot of the data we know about incomes more broadly. We know that people with graduate degrees tend to earn far more than their bachelor holding counterparts, and that gap is only widening with time. Now, I think the really interesting thing from the gender perspective here is how this plays out by marriage. So most couples in the US are married households. About 50% of adult households at any given time are going to be a married couple of household. And so their wealth isn't going to be broken out by gender. It's just sort of lumped together. And you can see that they own about $175,600 in net worth on average. Now that's at the very much the upper end of the range. And you see a nice distribution there, but in general, these folks have a lot more money, especially as they get into their older years. Now this is the graph that we're really going to hang out on for a while, because I think it's really interesting, and I think it tells us there's an interesting story here going on around wealth transfer, which you heard a little bit of on the last panel. You can see that throughout sort of the entire age progression at the younger years, men hold a lot more wealth than women do. As you can see, men less than 35 years have a little bit more, 35 to 54. That's when this gap really widens. Women hold a lot less wealth. That seems to have something to do with single females being more likely to have children. Children are expensive, as many of you probably know, and so people are less capable of saving money. But something changes in this 55 to 64 age group. You see a lot of women sort of just rocketing up and actually surpassing men in wealth. This is probably some of that transfer story that you guys were hearing about on the last panel. When women start getting divorced, when their spouses start dying, they start inheriting money and they start pushing up past the men. And then when you see women get to 65 and older, that is when their wealth really does surpass men. You can kind of barely see in this graph, but it is in fact higher. And so I think this is a really interesting question. Because what you do see is what is broadly consistent with the international literature, which is that women who are younger have a wealth gap, very closely tied to the earnings gap. You know, this familiar statistic that women earn 80 cents on the man's dollar. That does play through into the wealth gap. Also, women have more household expenses, but they really catch up with time. Now, this opens an interesting question of when people get into that sort of 65 and older group, and as women are inheriting all of that money, what are they going to do with it? And we know a little bit about how investments are held by wealth holding demographic. And so I think this is a really interesting chart. So we're going to go through it in some detail. The 250,000 to 500,000 group. So basically your middle savers. This is all aggregate data, and so it's pulled down by people with very small wealth holdings. And so you can think of those as sort of the upper middle class, most likely, tend to hold most of their equity in their home and in retirement accounts. You can see that in these pink bars here. That's interesting. That line has been shifting a little bit over time. It used to be the case that most equity was owned in the home. After the housing bubble and people got out of home ownership in a pretty significant way, you've seen that change a little bit, but still it remains the primary wealth building vehicle for most people in the US. But what you really see change is when you get to this upper income group. So $500,000 and over, you see people really shift toward retirement accounts as their primary wealth savings, and then also into other categories like annuities and trusts and rental property equity. And so just a very different and often more active wealth ownership for people who are in sort of these upper income groups, which is really relevant when you're thinking about the fact that, as you heard on the last panel, women are often not as active in knowing how to manage their wealth. And so as they're inheriting this money, and this money is kind of spread across a number of asset classes and different wealth holding vehicles, I think it's really interesting that they're going to be inheriting money that is potentially in a lot of places that they're not completely familiar with or comfortable with dealing with. Now, this is an interesting chart, and I think it speaks to the trend that we're seeing. So as you think about these women who are inheriting money, I think it's important to remember that this trend is going to become more stratified over time, because what we have really seen is that net worth for high-income people has just rocketed above where net worth is for everybody else. And so these folks at the sort of upper end of the range who are inheriting a lot are going to be inheriting differentially much more than people at other parts of the income distribution. So you can see, I like this graph because it connects these two ideas that I think often get conflated, income and wealth, and sort of shows you what's happening. You can see that it's a Pew analysis. You can see that upper income people have actually surpassed their pre-crisis wealth earnings or wealth holdings, whereas every other demographic is still basically below. So you can see that middle income group is at 110,000, used to be at 163,300 right before the crisis. So I think that this speaks to this idea that as we talk about these folks, it's increasingly important to think about how the distribution is working and how that's going to play into what they're inheriting. Now, I want to talk through a couple of final points here. One is that thanks to longer life expectancies, women could really stand to inherit large amounts of wealth. We're actually seeing a lot of this play out in places with more detailed data on this topic. There's actually a note out of Canada just this week showing that women are increasingly holding the bulk of wealth in that country. You often hear the statistic in the US that says women are now holding the majority of wealth. It's a little bit hard to back that up with the census data just because of the way, as we went through, the way that we separate out those numbers. But it's certainly plausible that over time that is going to become true. This trend is already underway globally, and so according to the Boston Consulting Group, women's wealth as a share of all private wealth climbed from 28% to 30% between 2010 and 2015. Again, that's globally, and so some of these trends are going to be quite different in the US. For example, in emerging markets, women tend to hold a lot less of the wealth in the more high income and high wealth families. And then I think there's a really important trend that bears talking about and that is important to keep in mind when you're thinking about this demographic, and that is that women are increasingly educated. So this has been happening really since the 1980s. That's when women's educational rates and bachelor's degree holding actually surpassed men's for the first time, or enrollment at any rate. And so what we've seen over time is that increasingly they're also getting the lion's share of PhDs, graduate degrees, et cetera. And education and more active wealth holding tend to go hand in hand. As we saw in the previous charts, education and higher incomes also go hand in hand. So as women become earners in their own right, not just this inheritance, it's important to think about how they're going to be holding that wealth and how that's going to change and how their activity, I think, around that wealth is going to change. It's also worth noting that women are having much better labor market outcomes in lower demographics relative to men than in previous generations. So Peggy was mentioning that story that I had recently written about millennial women. What it found was that millennial women have made more progress than basically any other demographic in the labor market since the crisis. Their participation rates have just been skyrocketing higher. At the same time, millennial men's labor force participation rates have made basically no progress. They haven't even recovered to pre-crisis levels. And so I think what you're seeing here is a real shift, and it's worth noting that there is still some gap between labor force participation, so the people looking or working as a share of the population, between men and women. Men still participate more, but that differential is shrinking really significantly for this millennial age group. And so I think that's really important to think about, because as you see these folks grow up and grow into their prime earning and prime spending years, it's going to matter to who holds the wealth in America. And so that is all I had for you. But if you have any questions, you want to chat later, you can definitely find me on the sidelines. Thanks so much.